The gavel echoed like a gunshot through the Cook County courthouse. Officer Bradley Jenkins smirked, looking down at the terrified black woman seated at the defense table. He had planted the narcotics himself, a flawless frame-up, just like the dozen he'd pulled off before to inflate his arrest record. He was the undisputed king of the streets, utterly untouchable. But as Bradley took the witness stand, ready to permanently seal her fate under oath, he didn't know one crucial, career-ending detail. The trembling woman he was lying about was a federal agent, and her entire task force was waiting just outside the courtroom doors. The rain was coming down in icy, diagonal sheets on the night of November 12th, turning the asphalt of Chicago's South Side into a slick, black mirror. Officer Bradley Jenkins sat in his cruiser, the engine idling with a low, predatory hum. He drummed his fingers against the leather steering wheel, his eyes scanning the sparse midnight traffic. At 36 years old, Bradley was a 12-year veteran of the 14th District, a decorated officer on paper, but a ruthless opportunist in reality. Bradley didn't patrol the streets to protect and serve. He patrolled to harvest. He had spent a decade perfecting a deeply corrupt system, preying on those who lacked the money, connections, or voice to fight back. He targeted the vulnerable, single mothers coming home from late shifts, teenagers in beat-up sedans, and people of color who he knew the justice system was already primed to disbelieve. Tonight, his quota was looking a little light, and the precinct captain had been breathing down the squad's necks about drug enforcement numbers. Bradley needed a win. He needed an easy target. That was when he spotted the 2014 silver Honda Civic. The car was moving slightly under the speed limit, cautious in the heavy rain. Its right tail light was flickering, a minor equipment violation, but to Bradley, it was a golden ticket. He flipped on his light bar. The flashing red and blues illuminated the dark street, casting long, menacing shadows against the brick facades of the closed storefronts. The Civic pulled over immediately, its tires scraping against the wet curb. Bradley took his time. He ran the plates through his mobile data terminal. No warrants, clean record. Registered to a Chloe Daniels. He stepped out of his cruiser, the cold rain immediately soaking into his uniform shirt. He adjusted his heavy-duty belt, resting his right hand casually near his sidearm, a deliberate intimidation tactic, as he approached the driver's side window. The window rolled down. Inside was a young black woman in her late 20s, wearing a faded grey hospital scrubs top. She looked exhausted, her eyes wide and nervously darting from Bradley's face to his badge. License, registration, and proof of insurance, Bradley barked, shining his maglite directly into her eyes to blind and disorient her. "Is there a problem, officer?" the woman asked, her voice trembling just enough to feed Bradley's ego. "Your tail light is out, and you were swerving back there. Have you been drinking tonight, Ms.?" He paused, looking at the ID she handed him with a shaking hand. "Daniels." "No, sir. I just got off a 14-hour shift at Cook County General." "The rain makes it hard to see," she replied politely. Bradley leaned in closer, invading her space, letting the smell of his wet wool uniform and stale coffee wash over her. "Step out of the vehicle, please." "For a tail light?" Chloe asked, a flicker of genuine fear crossing her face. "Step out of the car, or I will remove you from it," Bradley threatened, his voice dropping an octave. Chloe complied, stepping out into the freezing rain. Bradley instructed her to stand by the rear bumper, facing away from him. He then walked back to the open driver's side door and began to rummage through her vehicle. He tore through the center console, tossing her registration papers onto the floor mats. He checked the glove box. Nothing. But Bradley wasn't looking for evidence. He was looking for an opportunity. With his back turned to Chloe, Bradley seamlessly reached into his tactical vest. His fingers brushed against a small plastic baggie filled with 2 grams of crystallized methamphetamine, confiscated off a junkie 2 weeks prior, and never logged into the evidence room. It was his drop gear. With practiced sleight of hand, he shoved the baggie deep underneath the passenger seat, wedging it against the metal track. Bradley backed out of the car and walked over to Chloe. He put on his best performance of righteous indignation. "Well, Miss Daniels, care to explain why there's a bag of crystal meth shoved under your passenger seat?" Chloe's eyes went wide. "What? No, that's not mine. I've never done drugs in my life." "Please, officer, you have to believe me. I don't know how that got there." "Save it for the judge," Bradley sneered, violently grabbing her wrists and slapping the cold steel handcuffs onto her with unnecessary force, pinching her skin. He loved this part. The absolute power. The look of utter hopelessness in their eyes. As he shoved her into the back of his cruiser, Bradley felt a familiar rush of adrenaline. It was a clean bust, a felony possession charge, another feather in his cap, and another statistical notch for the 14th District. He looked at her in the rearview mirror as she sat in the cage, crying silently, her head bowed in defeat. Bradley smiled. It was almost too easy. What Officer Bradley Jenkins didn't know, and couldn't possibly fathom in his wildest, most paranoid dreams, was that Chloe Daniels was not a weary hospital nurse. She was Special Agent Naomi Carter of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, attached to the Chicago Field Office's elite public corruption task force. And she wasn't crying because she was scared. She was crying because she was putting on the Oscar-winning performance of a lifetime. Hidden beneath the collar of Naomi's faded grey scrubs was a sub-miniature wire mesh microphone. Sewn into the seam of her jeans was a GPS locator, and parked in an unmarked black surveillance van 3 blocks away, listening to every single word of the illegal traffic stop in crisp, high-definition audio, were Supervisory Special Agent William Henderson and Agent Gregory Miller. The FBI had been quietly building a racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization's RICO case against the 14th District for 8 grueling months. Anonymous complaints had flooded the DOJ for years regarding a localized gang operating out of police cruisers, officers who extorted local businesses, stole cash from drug raids, and planted evidence to boost their arrest quotas for federal funding. The name that came up most frequently was Bradley Jenkins. But Bradley was smart. He never left a paper trail, he intimidated witnesses into silence, and he always ensured his squad car's dash-com mysteriously malfunctioned during his questionable stops. The Bureau needed airtight, irrefutable proof. They couldn't rely on the testimonies of convicted felons or terrified civilians. Defense attorneys would tear them apart on the stand. They needed a federal agent to catch him in the act. They needed a sting operation. Naomi had volunteered. At 31, she was one of the brightest rising stars in the Bureau. With a law degree from Georgetown and 5 years of deep undercover experience fighting organized crime, she knew exactly how to play the prey. For 3 weeks, Naomi had stalked Bradley's patrol routes. She drove the silver Civic with the rigged, faulty tail light through his sectors, waiting to be hunted. Tonight, the predator had finally taken the bait. Sitting in the freezing, urine-scented holding cell at the 14th District Precinct, Naomi maintained her cover flawlessly. When the booking officer, a burly sergeant named Thomas O'Reilly, aggressively fingerprinted her and mocked her tears, she internalized every detail, committing his badge number and face to her mental database. She spent 14 hours in lockup, eating stale bologna sandwiches and experiencing the agonizing, dehumanizing reality that innocent citizens faced every day in this precinct. Finally, a man in a sharp suit arrived. It was Michael Davies, a highly respected Chicago defense attorney. To the precinct officers, Davies was just a high-priced lawyer hired by a desperate family. In reality, Davies was a former federal prosecutor who had been read into the FBI operation. He paid her exorbitant bail in cash. Once they were safely inside Davies's soundproofed Mercedes-Benz, miles away from the precinct, Naomi dropped the terrified nurse persona. Her posture straightened, her eyes hardened, and she let out a long, exhausted sigh. "You got him?" Michael asked, turning the heater on high. Naomi reached under her collar, extracting the tiny recording device, and held it up. "We got him, Michael. We have the illegal search, the lack of probable cause, the intimidation, and the exact moment he planted the narcotics. The audio is crystal clear." "Henderson is going to be ecstatic," Michael chuckled, pulling onto the expressway. "But you know the drill, Naomi. The audio isn't enough. A good PBA lawyer could argue the mic picked up ambient noise, or that you had the drugs on you before he searched the car. We need to lock him into his perjury on the public record. We need him to lie under oath." Naomi nodded, her jaw set with fierce determination. "I know. We take it to trial. We let him think he's won. We let him build his own gallows." Over the next 3 months, the trap was meticulously assembled. The FBI allowed the local prosecutor's office to proceed with the felony drug charges against Chloe Daniels. District Attorney Richard Hughes, a tough-on-crime prosecutor who was completely unaware of the federal sting, saw the case as a slam dunk. Officer Jenkins was his star witness, a decorated cop with a solid track record. Hughes pushed for a harsh sentence, offering Naomi a plea deal of 3 years in state prison if she confessed. Through Michael Davies, Naomi vehemently rejected the plea deal. She demanded a bench trial. She wanted her day in court. Bradley Jenkins was thrilled. A trial meant overtime pay for his court appearances. He didn't sweat the details. He had testified in 100 trials just like this one. He knew the script by heart. The defense attorney would try to poke holes in his story, the judge would side with the badge, and the defendant would be hauled off in chains. It was a well-oiled machine, and he was the master operator. As the trial date of February 15th approached, Naomi spent hours in the federal building with Agent Miller and Attorney Davies, rehearsing every possible angle. They analyzed Bradley's past testimonies, identifying his speech patterns and the specific lies he leaned on when challenged. They weren't just going to beat him, they were going to dismantle him piece by piece, exposing the rot at the core of the 14th District. The morning of February 15th was bitterly cold, the Chicago wind howling against the thick glass windows of the Cook County Circuit Court. Inside courtroom 302, the air was stifling and thick with tension. Judge Arthur Pendleton, an aging jurist with a reputation for leaning heavily in favor of law enforcement, sat high upon his wooden bench, peering over his reading glasses. Naomi sat at the defense table, dressed in a modest, inexpensive beige cardigan and slacks, projecting the image of a ruined, terrified civilian. Beside her, Michael Davies shuffled his legal pads, looking outwardly stressed, but internally calm as a bomb squad technician. District Attorney Richard Hughes stood at the prosecutor's podium, looking confident. "The state calls Officer Bradley Jenkins to the stand," Hughes announced. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Bradley Jenkins walked down the center aisle, looking like an absolute paragon of justice. He wore his Class A dress uniform, perfectly pressed, his brass polished to a mirror shine, medals pinned proudly to his chest. He exuded an aura of untouchable authority. He didn't even look at Naomi as he walked past. To him, she was just a ghost, already erased from society. Bradley raised his right hand. "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." "So help me God," he stated, his voice booming with practiced conviction. He took his seat in the witness box. D.A. Hughes began the direct examination, walking Bradley through the events of November 12th. Bradley was a master storyteller. He spoke clearly, using precise law enforcement jargon to make his illegal actions sound like textbook police work. "Officer Jenkins, can you describe the defendant's demeanor when you initiated the traffic stop?" Hughes asked. "She was highly erratic, objectionably nervous, and profusely sweating, despite the cold weather." Bradley lied effortlessly, staring directly at the judge. "Based on my 12 years of experience in narcotics interdiction, these are classic physiological indicators of someone attempting to conceal contraband." "And what did you find upon conducting a lawful search of the vehicle?" "I recovered a plastic bag containing approximately 2 grams of crystal methamphetamine, deliberately concealed underneath the passenger seat track, accessible to the driver," Bradley answered, his face an impenetrable mask of stoicism. "Thank you, officer. Nothing further," Hughes said, smiling as he sat down. He leaned over to his assistant, whispering that they had this one in the bag. Judge Pendleton turned his gaze to the defense table. "Mr. Davies, cross-examination." Michael Davies stood up, buttoning his suit jacket slowly. He picked up a single sheet of paper and walked over to the podium. "Officer Jenkins," Davies began, his tone deceptively mild. "You testified that my client was profusely sweating and highly erratic. Is that correct?" "That is correct, Counselor." "You also stated that your cruiser's dash cam was malfunctioning that evening, which is why we have no video evidence of this erratic behavior." "Correct." Bradley smirked, a microscopic twitch of the lips. "We have older equipment in the 14th District, sir. The system experienced a hard drive failure. I reported it to my sergeant at the end of my shift." "How convenient," Davies mused, pacing slightly. "Officer Jenkins, you are under oath today. The penalty for perjury in a felony trial is severe. I want to give you one final opportunity to revise your statement. Did you, or did you not, plant those narcotics in Ms. Daniels' vehicle?" D.A. Hughes jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is badgering the witness and making baseless, inflammatory accusations." "Sustained," Judge Pendleton barked, glaring at Davies. "Watch your tone, Mr. Davies. This is a courtroom, not a theater." Bradley leaned forward in the witness chair, his arrogance fully taking over. He looked directly at Davies, then shifted his gaze to Naomi, a look of pure, unadulterated contempt in his eyes. "I don't need to revise anything. I found the drugs in her car. She's a criminal, plain and simple. I know exactly what I saw, and I know exactly what I did." Davies stopped pacing. A heavy, chilling silence fell over the courtroom. The defense attorney didn't look defeated. He looked like a predator that had just snapped the jaws of a trap shut. "You know exactly what you did," Davies repeated quietly, letting the words hang in the air. "Yes," Bradley fired back, defiant and proud. Davies turned back to his table and nodded at Naomi. Naomi, who had been sitting with her head bowed, slowly lifted her face. The look of the terrified, broken nurse vanished completely. Her posture straightened, her shoulders squared, and a look of cold, calculating authority settled onto her features. She looked Bradley dead in the eyes, and for the very first time since the traffic stop, a sliver of unease shot down the corrupt cop's spine. "Your Honor," Davies said, his voice ringing out with sudden, electrifying power. "At this time, the defense would like to call its first and only witness. I call Special Agent Naomi Carter of the Federal Bureau of Investigation to the stand." Bradley's breath hitched in his throat. The blood drained from his face so fast he felt dizzy. He looked around the courtroom, confused. Special Agent? What the hell was Davies talking about? "Mr. Davies, what is the meaning of this?" Judge Pendleton asked, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. "Who is Agent Carter?" Davies smiled, gesturing to the woman sitting beside him. "She is sitting right here, Your Honor. The woman the state knows as Chloe Daniels." The silence in courtroom 302 was absolute, thick and suffocating. The air seemed to have been violently sucked out of the room. District Attorney Richard Hughes froze halfway out of his chair, his mouth hanging open in a grotesque mask of confusion. On the bench, Judge Arthur Pendleton's gavel slipped from his loose grip, clattering loudly against the polished mahogany. But it was Officer Bradley Jenkins whose reaction was the most visceral. The smug, untouchable aura that had radiated from him just moments prior evaporated instantly. His skin lost all its color, turning a sickly, translucent shade of gray. His knuckles turned stark white as he gripped the wooden railing of the witness box, his knuckles trembling so violently that the wood actually groaned. I don't understand," Judge Pendleton finally stammered, looking from the terrified police officer to the defense table. "Mr. Davies, this is highly irregular. The defendant's name on the docket is Chloe Daniels." Michael Davies didn't flinch. He stood tall, the absolute master of the courtroom. "Your Honor, Chloe Daniels is a federally protected alias, sanctioned by the United States Department of Justice. The woman sitting beside me is Special Agent Naomi Carter. For the past 8 months, she has been operating under deep cover as part of a joint federal task force investigating systemic corruption, extortion, and civil rights violations within the Chicago Police Department's 14th District." Naomi stood up. She didn't have her FBI windbreaker, but she didn't need it. The posture of the exhausted, broken nurse vanished completely, replaced by the rigid, disciplined stance of a federal law enforcement officer. She looked directly at Bradley. The hunter had just realized he was locked in a cage with the apex predator. "Agent Carter," Judge Pendleton said, his voice dropping an octave, recognizing the sheer gravity of what was unfolding. "Is this true?" "Yes, Your Honor," Naomi replied, her voice steady, clear, and ringing with absolute authority. "Badge number 884912, attached to the Chicago Field Office's Public Corruption Squad, operating out of the Dirksen Federal Building." Bradley felt a cold bead of sweat trace a slow, agonizing path down his spine. His mind raced frantically, desperately searching for an exit, a loophole, a lie that could save him. "They have nothing," he told himself. "It's her word against mine. I'm a decorated officer. She's just trying to play a federal trump card." "Your Honor, this is an ambush!" D.A. Hughes suddenly shouted, finally finding his voice. His face was flushed with embarrassment and anger. "The state had no prior knowledge of this. This is a state-level felony drug trial, not a federal circus." "It became a federal matter the moment your star witness committed perjury under oath, Mr. Hughes," Davies fired back seamlessly. "Your Honor, at this time, the defense wishes to enter into evidence Defense Exhibit A." Davies pulled a small silver USB drive from his breast pocket and held it up to the fluorescent courtroom lights. "What is that, Counselor?" Judge Pendleton asked, leaning so far forward he was nearly off his chair. "This, Your Honor, is a highly classified, federally sanctioned Title III wiretap recording, signed and authorized by United States Magistrate Judge Gabriel A. Fuentes of the Northern District of Illinois," Davies explained, dropping the real, heavy-hitting names that made the DA physically recoil. "It is the unedited, crystal-clear audio recording of the traffic stop that occurred on the night of November 12th. Recorded via a concealed wire worn by Agent Carter." A collective gasp echoed from the gallery. Bradley's heart slammed against his ribs like a trapped bird. A wire. She had been wearing a wire. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. Every word, every threat, the rustle of his vest. It was all captured. "Objection!" Hughes shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He knew his career was on the line if he prosecuted a federal agent on falsified evidence. "Chain of custody, Your Honor. We cannot verify the authenticity of—" "Overruled, Mr. Hughes," Judge Pendleton snapped, his face turning a furious shade of red. The judge was a man who respected the badge, but he despised being made a fool of in his own courtroom. He glared at Bradley, his eyes narrowing into hostile slits. "You will play that audio right now, Mr. Davies." Davies plugged the USB drive into the court's multimedia system. He pressed a button on his laptop. Static crackled through the courtroom speakers, followed by the heavy, rhythmic sound of rain hitting a car roof. Then, the audio played. "License, registration, and proof of insurance." Bradley's voice boomed through the courtroom. It sounded arrogant, aggressive. "Is there a problem, officer?" Naomi's voice played, feigning fear perfectly. "Your taillight is out, and you were swerving back there." The courtroom listened in dead silence as the audio painted a picture of undeniable abuse of power. They heard Bradley order her out of the car. Then came the damning silence. On the tape, there was the distinct sound of a tactical Velcro strap ripping open. Bradley reaching into his vest. A plastic crinkle. The metallic scraping of something being wedged under a metal seat track. "Well, Miss Daniels, care to explain why there's a bag of crystal meth shoved under your passenger seat?" Judge Pendleton closed his eyes, shaking his head in absolute disgust. D.A. Hughes dropped his pen, staring blankly at the mahogany table, realizing he had been used as an unwitting pawn by a dirty cop. The audio finished with the distinct, violent click of handcuffs and Naomi's fabricated sobs. Davies paused the recording. He walked slowly toward the witness box, where Bradley Jenkins was visibly hyperventilating. The invincible Chicago cop was suffocating under the crushing weight of his own hubris. "Officer Jenkins," Davies said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, "I will ask you one more time, and I remind you that you are currently sitting under the penalty of perjury in a court of law, with a federal agent sitting 10 feet away from you. Did you plant those drugs?" Bradley opened his mouth, but no words came out. His lips moved like a fish out of water. If he said yes, he confessed to a mountain of felonies. If he said no, he was committing perjury on top of the wiretap evidence. The trap was flawless. He was completely, utterly paralyzed. "Answer the question, officer!" Judge Pendleton roared, slamming his gavel so hard the handle cracked. "Did you plant evidence in my courtroom?" I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination," Bradley choked out, his voice a pathetic, reedy whisper. The courtroom erupted. Spectators murmured loudly. Reporters in the back row began furiously typing on their phones, and D.A. Hughes threw his hands up in absolute defeat. "The state immediately drops all charges against the defendant, Your Honor," Hughes announced, his voice shaking, "and the state requests that Officer Jenkins be held in contempt." But before Judge Pendleton could even issue the order, the heavy, double oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a violent crash. The chaotic noise in the courtroom instantly died, replaced by stunned silence, as a synchronized wall of absolute authority marched down the center aisle. Leading the charge was Supervisory Special Agent William Henderson, a towering, broad-shouldered man with a face carved from granite and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Flanking him were 4 heavily armed FBI tactical agents. They weren't wearing suits. They were wearing olive-drab tactical gear, heavy plate carriers, and navy blue windbreakers with the letters FBI emblazoned across their backs and chests in glaring yellow. The sheer presence of the federal government had just invaded the local courthouse, and nobody dared move a muscle. The local bailiffs, normally tasked with securing the room, immediately stepped back and lowered their hands, yielding jurisdiction without a single word spoken. Agent Henderson bypassed the prosecutor's table completely and walked straight to the center of the room, stopping directly in front of the judge's bench. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a thick stack of manila folders stamped with the seal of the Department of Justice. "Judge Pendleton," Henderson announced, his deep voice carrying flawlessly to the back row of the gallery. "Supervisory Special Agent Henderson, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I apologize for the interruption of your proceedings, but we have federal business with your witness." Judge Pendleton, still recovering from the shock of the wiretap, looked down at the federal agent. "Agent Henderson, this man has just committed blatant perjury in my courtroom. I was about to have him remanded. With all due respect, Your Honor, his perjury charge is just the appetizer," Henderson replied coldly. He turned on his heel, his hard eyes locking onto the pale, sweating, utterly defeated figure of Bradley Jenkins in the witness box. Henderson stepped up to the wooden gate of the witness stand. The 4 tactical agents moved in unison, forming a secure perimeter around Bradley. "Bradley Jenkins," Henderson stated, reading from the warrant in his hand. "By the authority of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois, I am serving you with a federal indictment. You are hereby under arrest for violations of Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. You are additionally charged with federal wire fraud, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and as of 5 minutes ago, felony perjury in a court of law." Bradley sat frozen, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The invincible shield of his badge had just shattered into a million irreparable pieces. This is a mistake," he stammered, his voice pathetic and small. "I'm a cop. I'm one of you. You can't do this to me." "You're a disgrace to that badge," Naomi Carter said, stepping out from behind the defense table and walking toward him. Her voice was ice cold, cutting through his panic like a scalpel. "You preyed on the weak because you thought nobody was watching. You thought you were the predator. You were wrong." "Stand up, Jenkins," Henderson ordered. When Bradley didn't move, his legs completely turned to jelly. 2 federal agents reached over the wooden partition. They grabbed Bradley by the biceps of his perfectly pressed dress uniform and violently hauled him to his feet. The sound of federal handcuffs clicking around Bradley's wrists echoed through the silent courtroom. It was the exact same harsh, metallic snap he had subjected Naomi to in the freezing rain 3 months prior. The poetry of the moment was not lost on anyone in the room. As the agents patted him down, stripping him of his Chicago Police Department badge and his department-issued Glock sidearm, Henderson turned back to the stunned gallery and the local prosecutor. "For the record, Mr. Hughes," Henderson addressed the district attorney, who was still standing completely rigid. "This is not an isolated arrest. At this exact moment, 80 federal agents are raiding the 14th District Precinct. We are executing federal search warrants on your precinct captain's office, the evidence lockers, and the personal residences of 6 other officers in Jenkins' squad." Bradley's head snapped up, his eyes wide with sheer terror. "What?" "That's right, Bradley," Naomi said, standing shoulder to shoulder with her commanding officer. "We didn't just want you. We wanted the whole nest. And thanks to your arrogance over the last 8 months, you led us right to them. Sergeant Thomas O'Reilly was taken into federal custody 20 minutes ago in his own driveway. The mention of his sergeant's arrest was the final nail in the coffin. The entire criminal enterprise he had helped build, the impenetrable brotherhood of corruption, was burning to the ground simultaneously. You have the right to remain silent." One of the tactical agents began reading the Miranda warning, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a federal court of law." "Take him out," Henderson commanded. The federal agents grabbed Bradley by the arms and began to march him down the center aisle of the courtroom. The perp walk. The ultimate walk of shame. As Bradley was paraded past the gallery, the spectators, who had watched him swagger in with arrogant pride just an hour earlier, now stared at him with absolute contempt. The local reporters were snapping photos furiously, capturing the spectacular downfall of a corrupt kingpin in a police uniform. When the oak doors of the courtroom swung open to the hallway, a chaotic flash of strobe lights blinded Bradley. The FBI had tipped off the major news networks. The hallway was packed with journalists, cameramen, and microphones. "Officer Jenkins, is it true you planted drugs on a federal agent?" "Jenkins, look over here. Are you facing 20 years in federal prison?" Bradley lowered his head, trying to hide his face from the blinding flashes of the cameras. But the federal agents kept his head up, marching him straight through the gauntlet of the press. He was pushed into the courthouse elevator, the heavy steel doors sliding shut, completely cutting him off from the world he once ruled. Back in the courtroom, Judge Pendleton let out a long, heavy breath, removing his reading glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked at Naomi Carter, who was standing quietly next to the defense table, packing her files into a briefcase. "Agent Carter," Judge Pendleton called out softly. Naomi paused, looking up at the bench. "Yes, Your Honor. In my 30 years on the bench, I have seen a lot of things," the judge said, his voice laced with genuine respect. "I have seen the worst of humanity, and unfortunately, I have seen men in uniform betray the public trust. But I have never seen a sting executed with such absolute precision." Pendleton paused, offering her a curt, respectful nod. "The city of Chicago owes you a debt of gratitude today." Naomi nodded back, a small, weary smile finally breaking through her stoic federal persona. "Just doing my job, Your Honor. Protecting and serving." She picked up her briefcase, turned, and walked out of the courtroom alongside Michael Davis, leaving the ruined, smoking crater of Bradley Jenkins' career behind them. The House of Cards had completely collapsed, but the real work, the cleaning of the 14th District, was just beginning. The Metropolitan Correctional Center in downtown Chicago is a brutalist, triangular concrete skyscraper that juts into the city skyline like a jagged tooth. It is a fortress designed specifically to house federal inmates awaiting trial, completely disconnected from the outside world. The windows are nothing more than 5-inch-wide slits, allowing only thin slivers of grey light to penetrate the suffocating gloom of the cell blocks. This was where Officer Bradley Jenkins found himself, precisely 4 hours after being dragged out of courtroom 302. Stripped of his immaculate dress uniform, Bradley was forced into a shapeless, scratchy, neon orange jumpsuit with the letters MCC Chicago stenciled across the back in bold black ink. The heavy federal chains around his waist and ankles clanked loudly against the cold linoleum floor as 2 silent Bureau of Prisons guards escorted him into Interrogation Room B on the 5th floor. They shackled his right wrist to a heavy steel ring bolted into the center of the metal table and walked out, locking the heavy steel door behind them with a deafening, final clack. For 20 minutes, Bradley sat in complete isolation. The adrenaline that had fueled his panic in the courtroom was fading, replaced by a cold, hollow dread that gnawed at the lining of his stomach. He was a cop. He knew how this game was played. The isolation was a tactic to break his psyche before the heavy hitters walked in. He tried to mentally prepare his defense. He would offer them his precinct captain, Richard Sullivan. He would give them the patrolman who skimmed cash off drug busts. He would trade his way out of this, just like he always did. The door opened. Supervisory Special Agent William Henderson walked in, followed by Special Agent Naomi Carter. Naomi was back in her standard bureau attire, a crisp white blouse, a dark navy blazer, and her FBI credentials hanging proudly from a silver chain around her neck. Henderson tossed a thick, 2-inch manila binder onto the metal table. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud. He didn't sit down. He just loomed over Bradley, his massive frame blocking the harsh overhead fluorescent light. "Let's skip the part where you pretend you don't know what's going on, Bradley," Henderson said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Right now, 80 federal agents are tearing the 14th District apart, down to the drywall. Captain Sullivan is currently in a cell 3 floors below you, crying like a newborn baby. So, before you open your mouth to negotiate, understand this. You have absolutely nothing we want." Bradley's throat was bone dry. He swallowed hard, trying to project a confidence he no longer possessed. You can't build a RICO case off one traffic stop. It's a single incident. My lawyer will tear that wiretap apart. He'll say I was following a tip." Naomi let out a short, humorless laugh. She pulled a chair out and sat across from him, leaning her elbows on the cold steel table. "You really think you were the start of this operation, Jenkins?" Naomi asked, her eyes locking onto his with terrifying intensity. "You think we spent 8 months just hoping you'd pull me over on a rainy Tuesday night?" Bradley frowned, his mind scrambling. "What are you talking about?" Naomi reached into the binder and pulled out an 8x10 glossy photograph, sliding it across the table. Bradley looked down, and the last remnants of his bravado shattered into a million irreparable pieces. It was a surveillance photo of a man sitting in a dark booth at a diner. The man was Sergeant Thomas O'Reilly, Bradley's direct supervisor, his mentor in corruption, and the man who had helped him orchestrate a dozen false arrests. But in the photo, O'Reilly was sitting across from Agent Henderson, and O'Reilly was crying. "3 months ago, your good friend Sergeant O'Reilly got sloppy," Naomi explained, tapping the photo with her index finger. "He tried to extort $15,000 from a local bodega owner in the West Loop. What O'Reilly didn't know was that the bodega owner's brother-in-law is an assistant United States attorney for the Northern District of Illinois. We picked O'Reilly up on a Tuesday morning while he was buying donuts." Bradley stared at the photo, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. "We sat him in this exact chair," Henderson added, leaning in close. "We told him he was looking at 20 years for extortion. He flipped in under 5 minutes. He gave us the ledgers, Bradley. He gave us the names, the badge numbers, the drop locations, and the offshore accounts. He gave us Captain Sullivan. And most importantly, he gave us you." "No," Bradley whispered, shaking his head. "Tommy wouldn't do that. We took an oath. The Blue Wall. The Blue Wall is a myth built by cowards to protect criminals," Naomi shot back, her voice laced with absolute disgust. "For the last 30 days, O'Reilly has been wearing a wire into the precinct. Every conversation you had with him by the coffee machine, every time you bragged about planting evidence, every time you laughed about destroying some poor kid's life to meet your arrest quota, we have it all on tape." Bradley felt physically sick. The room began to spin. "The traffic stop wasn't a fishing expedition, Bradley," Naomi continued, driving the final nail into his coffin. "It was a controlled sting. O'Reilly told us exactly what routes you like to hunt on. He told us exactly what kind of victims you preferred. Women, minorities, people driving older cars. We didn't just catch you making a mistake. We orchestrated the exact scenario you couldn't resist. And you walked right into the bear trap because your ego wouldn't let you do otherwise." I want to cooperate," Bradley begged, tears finally welling up in his eyes. The invincible Chicago cop was gone, replaced by a terrified, broken man staring down the barrel of a ruined life. "I can give you names of judges. I can give you the union reps who covered for us. Please, just give me a deal. I have a wife. I have 2 daughters. Sarah will leave me." Henderson slowly closed the binder. "We already have the judges, Jenkins. We already have the union reps. Like I said, you are the bottom of the barrel. As for your wife..." Henderson pulled out a piece of paper and slid it toward Bradley. It was a federal asset forfeiture notice. "When we raided your house an hour ago, we found the lockbox hidden behind the drywall in your basement," Henderson stated coldly. $250,000 in unmarked bills. Extortion money. The DOJ has officially seized your home, your vehicles, your bank accounts, and your police pension under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Bradley stared at the forfeiture notice, his vision blurring with tears. Everything he had stolen, and everything he had built on the broken backs of innocent people, was gone in an instant. "Sarah packed a suitcase while we were executing the warrant," Naomi said quietly, leaning back in her chair. "She took the girls. She told our agents she is filing for divorce by the end of the week. She said she couldn't look at you ever again." A guttural, agonizing sob ripped from Bradley's throat. He slumped forward, his forehead resting against the cold steel table, the chains rattling as his body shook with the sheer magnitude of his destruction. He was completely, utterly alone. The predator had been stripped of his fangs, his pack, and his territory. "You're facing 5 counts of deprivation of rights under color of law, 3 counts of perjury, and 1 count of federal racketeering," Henderson said, his voice entirely devoid of pity. "That's a maximum of 45 years in a federal penitentiary. The U.S. Attorney's Office is not offering a plea deal. They are going to make a spectacular, highly publicized example out of you." Henderson and Naomi stood up simultaneously. "Enjoy the MCC, Jenkins," Naomi said, pausing at the door. She looked back at him one last time, remembering the absolute terror he had tried to inflict on her in the freezing rain. "You finally get to see what the justice system looks like from the other side of the cage. The wheels of federal justice move slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine." For 14 agonizing months, Bradley Jenkins sat in the Metropolitan Correctional Center, watching his entire life disintegrate through the 5-inch slit of his cell window. His high-priced defense attorney, paid for by the police union, dropped him the moment the union itself was subpoenaed in the RICO sweep. Stripped of his assets and his pension, Bradley was assigned a public defender, a young, exhausted lawyer named David Crane, who plainly told him that going to trial against the FBI's mountain of audio evidence was akin to stepping in front of a speeding freight train. By the time his sentencing date arrived, the 14th District had been decimated. Captain Sullivan had pleaded guilty and received 12 years. Sergeant O'Reilly, despite his cooperation, received 7 years. 32 officers had been indicted, fired, or forced into early retirement. It was the largest police corruption purge in the history of the city. On a bright Tuesday morning in April, Bradley Jenkins was brought into the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois for sentencing. He looked nothing like the proud, arrogant cop who had strutted into the state courthouse a year prior. He had lost 30 pounds. His hair had thinned dramatically, graying at the temples. His posture was perpetually stooped, his spirit completely broken by the relentless, grinding reality of federal lockup. The gallery of the courtroom was packed to absolute capacity. But this time, it wasn't filled with news reporters looking for a headline. It was filled with the victims, dozens of people, young men whose lives had been derailed by falsified drug charges, single mothers who had been extorted for cash, families who had been terrorized during illegal raids, sat silently in the wooden pews, watching the man who had destroyed them finally face his reckoning. Naomi Carter sat in the back row, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, watching the culmination of her task force's relentless work. United States District Judge Eleanor Harrison, a stern, brilliant jurist with zero tolerance for public corruption, sat behind the bench, looking down at Bradley with a gaze that could freeze water. "Mr. Jenkins," Judge Harrison began, her voice echoing through the silent, cavernous courtroom, "you have been given the opportunity to speak before this court passes sentence. Do you have anything to say?" Bradley stood up, his chains rattling loudly. His public defender, David Crane, gently touched his arm in a futile gesture of support. Bradley looked back at the gallery. He saw the faces of the people he had framed. He looked for his wife, Sarah, but she was nowhere to be found. The divorce had been finalized 3 months ago. She had moved to Ohio, changing her and her daughter's last names to escape the toxic, suffocating stigma of his crimes. "Your Honor," Bradley started, his voice trembling and weak. I lost my way. The pressure of the job, the quotas, the culture of the precinct. It swallowed me. I thought I was cleaning up the streets. I thought the ends justified the means. I am so sorry to the people I hurt. I have lost my family, my career, my home. I am begging this court for mercy." Judge Harrison did not flinch. She adjusted her glasses, peering down at him with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. "Mr. Jenkins, you didn't lose your way," Judge Harrison stated, her voice slicing through his pathetic excuses like a newly sharpened blade. "Losing your way implies a momentary lapse in judgment. What you orchestrated was a calculated, predatory, and prolonged campaign of domestic terror against the very citizens you swore a sacred oath to protect." The gallery remained dead silent, hanging on to every word. "You weaponized the power of the state to feed your own ego and your own wallet," the judge continued relentlessly. "You used the badge as a shield to commit felonies, and you used the justice system as a sword to ruin innocent lives. You speak of the culture of the precinct as if you were a victim of it. You were not a victim, Mr. Jenkins. You were the architect of that culture. You taught younger officers how to lie. You taught them how to plant evidence. You turned a police precinct into an organized crime syndicate." Bradley lowered his head, tears spilling over his hollow cheeks, hitting the wooden table in front of him. "The most sacred currency we have in a civilized society is the public's trust in law enforcement," Judge Harrison said, her tone finalizing his fate. "When a police officer fabricates evidence and commits perjury, he doesn't just destroy one life, he poisons the entire well of justice. He gives every criminal a loophole, and he gives every honest citizen a reason to fear the police." Judge Harrison picked up her gavel. "Bradley Jenkins, for the charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, federal racketeering, and perjury, it is the judgment of this court that you be committed to the custody of the United States Bureau of Prisons to serve a term of 216 months. That is 18 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There is no parole in the federal system. You will serve every single day of that sentence." The gavel came down with a deafening crack. A collective breath was released in the gallery. Quiet tears of profound relief fell from the faces of the victims. Justice, blind and absolute, had finally swung her terrifying sword. "Officers, remand the prisoner," the judge ordered. The federal marshals grabbed Bradley by the arms. As they turned him around to face the gallery, Naomi Carter stood up from the back row. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just looked at him with the cold, unyielding stare of a sheepdog that had successfully ripped the throat out of a wolf. Bradley couldn't hold her gaze. He looked down at his shackled feet as he was marched out of the courtroom and into oblivion. 2 weeks later, an armored Bureau of Prisons transport bus pulled through the towering, razor wire-topped gates of the United States Penitentiary, USP, Terre Haute in Indiana. It is a high-security facility housing some of the most violent federal inmates in the country. Bradley Jenkins, stripped of his name and reduced to inmate number 84729 or 024, stepped off the bus. The Midwestern wind was howling, biting through his thin khaki prison uniform. As he was marched across the concrete yard toward the towering cell blocks, the general population inmates in the recreation yard pressed their faces against the chain-link fences. Word travels incredibly fast in the federal system. The inmates knew exactly who was arriving. They knew he was a dirty cop who planted evidence. They knew he was a coward who preyed on the weak. The jeers, the threats, and the promises of horrific violence rained down on him from hundreds of voices, echoing off the concrete walls like a chorus of demons welcoming him to hell. The guards shoved him into his 6x 9-foot concrete cell on C block and slammed the heavy steel door shut. The electronic lock engaged with a heavy metallic thud that resonated deep in his bones. Bradley walked over to the thin, stained mattress on his steel bunk and sat down. He stared at the cinder block wall. The realization of his reality finally crashed down upon him in its entirety. He was 37 years old. He would not see the outside of a prison wall until he was 55. He would never see his daughters grow up. He would spend the next 6,570 days living in a state of constant, suffocating fear, surrounded by the exact type of men he had spent his life illegally locking up. Karma hadn't just knocked on his door. It had kicked it off the hinges, burned his house down, and locked him in the basement. Miles away in Chicago, Naomi Carter sat in a quiet diner, drinking a cup of black coffee and reading the morning paper. The headline read, "Corrupt Cop Gets 18 Years. 14th District Scandal Closes." She took a sip of her coffee, folded the newspaper neatly, and left a tip on the table. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Agent Henderson. They had a new lead on a corrupt judge in Cook County. Naomi smiled, stood up, and walked out into the crisp Chicago morning. The predator was locked in a cage, but the sheepdog's work was never truly done. If this story of absolute justice and hard karma kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. It's deeply satisfying to see a corrupt predator think they hold all the cards, only to walk blindly into a federal trap they can't escape. Officer Jenkins learned the hardest way possible that nobody is above the law when the real authorities step in. What did you think of Agent Carter's brilliant undercover sting? Let us know in the comments below, share this video with true crime fans, and subscribe for more incredible dramatic real-life stories.